Very good. Well, let me start by saying a very warm welcome, both from myself, Monica Bohm-Duchin, the founding director of the Insiders Outsiders project that I suspect quite a few of you will know about, and also from Aviva Deutsch, who's the executive director of Jewish Renaissance magazine. And between the two of us, we have been organizing a number of internment related events, both online and indeed in person. I suspect that of the many people gathered here tonight, a fair number of you will indeed have been with us in person on the Isle of Man. It was, although I say it myself, a fantastically rich and rewarding and thought-provoking trip that we organized in late March. So I think for those of you who were there, this will be particularly meaningful, but equally for those of you who weren't, hopefully it will bring the whole subject further to light. So I just urge you all to make sure that you are muted. I think you probably are, you know the ropes by now. The talk is being recorded, so there will be an opportunity to revisit it on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel and also the Jewish Renaissance channel. So where do I start? It's such a rich subject. We've passed the 80th anniversary, as you know, would have been 2020, but of course COVID intervened with a vengeance. But we weren't going to be put off by that, and we organized, in advance of us actually doing the trip itself, a whole array of events, as I mentioned, that sort of threw different lights, that actually sort of focus on different aspects of the internment, the British government's internment of so-called enemy aliens in the early summer of 1940. I'm hesitating slightly because I just find it endlessly interesting. There is still so much to find out, and I will be completely frank that actually I only discovered that speaker today, Dave Hannigan, the author of Barbed Wire University, had published this book quite by accident. I shouldn't really have admit this to you, Dave, but actually it was when we were on the Isle of Man that actually I think it was Yvonne Cresswell, the wonderful curator or recently retired curator of social history at the Manx Museum, who mentioned it to me, and I thought, aha, another person interested in the subject and doing more detailed research. So it's my very, very great pleasure to welcome Dave as our speaker today. You've got on the screen in front of you the full title of the book. Came out in America. It is actually an American publication, which in itself is interesting, with the Lyons Press in Connecticut quite recently. There is, incidentally, while I think about it, a 30% discount being offered for those attending the talk, which I will tell you more about later. I think, Dave, you'll probably tell us how it all came to happen, but if not, I shall certainly quiz you later. But let me just start by giving you a very, very brief introduction to Dave Hannigan. He's a sports columnist with the Sunday Tribune, the Evening Echo, and New York's Irish Echo. He's been living in the States. He's of Irish origin and background, but he's been living in the United States for 20 years or so. He's the author of 3 previous books, all, I believe, on aspects of 20th century Irish history. I hope I've got that right. And he's also an adjunct professor of history at Suffolk County Community College on Long Island in the United States. So I think without further ado, I should hand over to Dave to take the stage, as it were. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Monica. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm very happy to be here tonight. I'm only sorry that I can't be in London, one of my favorite cities in the world, to do this in person. But I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to people about about the book and about this topic in general. The cover is very shamelessly the first item on the PowerPoint here. The untold story of the interned Jewish intellectuals who turned an island prison into the most remarkable school in the world. It's a very unwieldy title. I apologize for that. Publisher was trying to pack a lot in. But I will start by just, the first slide that I show. Obviously this is an English or a British audience, but the first slide I show when I talk to an American audience is the map of Ireland and Great Britain with the Isle of Man in the middle. Obviously you people all know where the Isle of Man is. Some of you indeed have been there, I know, as part of this group. So I'm kind of, this is a superfluous slide, if you like. Even though I grew up in Ireland, 80 miles from the Isle of Man, I'd never been there until I went to research it for this book. And it's a fascinating place, even aside, I think, from the internment episodes in World War I and World War II. It's a fascinating, odd, curious, slightly different part of Britain. At least that's how I found it as an outsider when I visited there. This character in the first slide, well, these are two main characters really in this book. Klaus Henriksen, who I call in the book the keeper of the flame. He was a young man who entered the camp, was in the camp in the first intake in the summer of 1940, but dedicated much of his life afterwards to talking about the camp and ensuring that the people who went there, who spent time there, were recognized for the work that they did. And this painting is by Kurt Schwitters, who is probably the most famous artist to spend time in the camp. Certainly, if you gauge how many books have been written about Kurt Schwitters, he's probably the most famous. There's weird ways of gauging celebrity. The fact that Kurt Schwitters featured in a Monty Python sketch about famous artists in a bicycle race is one way that I always think, wow, that's quite an impact on popular culture, aside from, art history and stuff like that. So these are two of the main characters, but I'll start with an overview, which again, I apologize if many of you attending tonight probably already know this, but we're in the summer of 1940. We're in June, July 1940. The first year of the war has not gone well for Britain and the Allies. There's a lot of paranoia and fear, some of it justified, of course, that the Germans are going to invade the British mainland. And over the previous number of years, since 1933, basically, you have about 70,000 German and Austrian refugees who have fled their homelands because of the increased Nazification of those countries and fled Hitler, many of them Jewish, many of them being persecuted for other reasons. And they've fled to England because England is a safe haven, England is a sanctuary. But now, in the deteriorating military situation, there are many in England who feel that these men could, and women, some of them, could be a potential fifth column and a possible threat, sort of sleeper cells, if you will. So that's the atmosphere that's building in May, June 1940. And then this leads to Churchill to issue an order saying, collar the lot, which means arrest them all, round them all up, and intern them all. Up to this point, every refugee had to go to court and be classified category A, which is you are a real threat, which was about 500 of them. Category B, you're a minor threat, which was a few thousand. And then category C, which was your no threat, which was the rest of them really. But now this sweeping order says arrest them all and intern them all. Camps, ad hoc camps are set up all over Britain. Marion race courses, Kempton Park race course would be one example. Worth Mills, an old workhouse, would be another one, possibly the worst of all the camps. So these men are suddenly being rounded up. The roundup is, as an Irishman, I would like to say very English. It's very polite. It's very, there's a lot of manners about it. Klaus Henriksen tells the story of basically, if you got out of your house by 8 in the morning before the police called, then they wouldn't come looking for you for the rest of the day. So you were okay for one more day, which also tells you how much of a threat the police thought that you were. Then Henriksen comes home one night to his digs in London. He had fled Germany after Kristallnacht. And he comes home to his digs in London and his landlady says, the police are coming for you tomorrow. And he said, why is that? And he said, well, they were looking for somebody else. And I said, he's not here anymore, but Mr. Henriksen is here. So if you could stay in the morning, they're going to arrest you. And he did, and they did, which is, it's a very polite, very strange kind of surreal atmosphere to it. Another two characters, Fritz Hallgarten and Ronald Stent, when they're arrested at Hallgarten's house, they ask, can they stop at a shop on the way so they can get some supplies? And the police say, of course, you can go into the store and buy some stuff to bring with you to the camp. So there's a weirdness to the setup, but I don't think that should, diminish the fact that these men are having their lives interrupted. They are being picked up taken away from wives and families in some cases, picked up at their jobs. You know, some of the college professors, Paul Jacobstill, who was a professor of archaeology at Oxford University, is literally working at his desk when the police walk in and say, you know, we're taking you. And he's like, can I just put this stuff away that I was working on, these artifacts? So their lives are interrupted. They're brought to these various holding pens, if you want to describe it, you know, all around Britain. And then bit by bit, they're split up and they're assigned to full-time camps. There were a lot of camps on the Isle of Man. The Isle of Man had been used in World War I in similar effect. And the camp, obviously, that I chose to write this book about is Hutchinson Camp, which was based on a square up at the top of the hill in Douglas in the Isle of Man. Now, many of you have been there. So you will understand the scene that I paint. They're on board a ship called the Tynwald, which had just been used. This is July 1940. They'd been brought by train to Liverpool. Walking through Liverpool, they are spat at by some of the locals who see them as real German threats. The men are kind of bemused by this. Because they had fled Germany and Austria because of Hitler. They were anti-Hitler. Many of them had worked hard against Hitler politically, especially in the 30s. And now they are basically put on board a ship called the Tynwald. They have no idea where they're going. They have never heard of the Isle of Man, most of them. The ship, there's a lot of rumors on the ship. Where could we be heading? Are we being sent back to Germany? And when they pull into Douglas, they see the Triskelion, the three-legged flag of the Isle of Man. And when that flutters in the breeze, a couple of them think that it might be the Nazi symbol or, you know, the swastika. So there's a little bit of paranoia about that. But that will show you how real the fear was from these men. So they arrive in Douglas, the port of Douglas on the Isle of Man, and they are I'll just go forward here. This is their ultimate destination. This is Hutchinson Square. So they are literally split up into groups. They're all assigned to different camps. And about 1,000 men end up at this camp, Hutchinson Square, which, as you can see, and as some of you will know because you visited it in your time on the Isle of Man, you know, it's a very genteel Edwardian boarding houses. This was a square of bed and breakfasts where British holidaymakers would come in the 20s and 30s. If you just see the fence there leading to the green area, when, you know, inside that green area at this point, when this British soldier is guarding them with the bayonet drawn, inside in that green area, there's a crazy golf or a mini golf course that was there for holidaymakers. So all of the landladies gave up their houses. The houses were now turned into impromptu internment facilities, and a barbed wire fence was rung around the entire Hutchinson Square area. And these men, this was going to be their internment camp home, and they did not know how long they were going to be there. So again, I will overuse the word absurd. I will overuse the word surreal, but that's what a lot of this is because, you know, when we think of an internment camp, we think of men and women behind fences and canvas tents. These were just houses, landladies' houses. Many of them had pianos in the living room from when, you know, every boarding house would have a piano where people could play songs at night and stuff like that. So this is the camp that they enter, Hutchinson Internment Camp or Hutchinson Square Camp. And these are the men. These are a sample of the men. I think we can all agree, looking at that just random photograph, which I think is from the Imperial War Museum. Oh no, it's actually from the Tate Gallery archive. These are the men at roll call in the morning, and they do not look like a Nazi fifth column, do they? Really, they do not look like a threatening group of men, and they weren't. Many of them were there, you know, many of them did not know why they were there and could not understand why Britain, this country they saw as a beacon of light, as Europe succumbed to the Nazi darkness, and suddenly Britain kind of turned on them by putting them in these camps. The roll call was a haphazard affair every morning because the British soldiers struggled with the German and Austrian names. And I can empathize with that because I struggled a lot as well as I was researching and writing this book with the names and trying to make sure I got the spellings correct. And, you know, when your German is not good, that's a struggle. So, you know, this is the morning scene, roll call every morning. And then another part of the morning routine was going to get rations, everything from toilet paper to milk to food. Each group of men, 30 or 40 of them, assigned to a house. Each house appointed a camp father or a house father who was in charge of the house. And he represented the house at street meetings and then at camp meetings. And there was a camp father elected whose job it was to represent the men to the camp commander. I haven't really got into the art and the culture stuff yet. I will. I swear I'm just trying to get, paint you a picture of the logistics. And it was a camp, and it was, a quote unquote kind of like a prisoner of war camp, really, as you can see. So this character, this is Commander Hubert Daniel, who is the man in charge. And when I talk in a little bit about the culture and the vibrant culture of the place, it's partly down to him, because he was very, very competitive about his camp. He wanted his camp to be the best camp on the island, which sounds like a really weird thing for a guy, who's in a war situation and supposedly detaining men who are a threat to British security. But he wanted his camp to be the best of all of the camps. So for instance, his camp will play a soccer match against Camp Onchen, another one of the Douglas camps, and Camp Onchen will defeat them at soccer, and Daniel will be really upset, at which point one prisoner, Siegfried Oppenheimer, will come to him and say, who's an art dealer actually in his private life or in his pre-war life, and Oppenheimer will say, listen, you've got fantastic artists here, why don't you have an art exhibit to showcase their work? And he does, and it's a huge success, and it makes the camp look great. It's also very good mentally for the artists who are stuck in the camp, and he has a second one later on. So he is determined to make his camp look good, which helps a lot of the people in the camp, but also leads to allegations of unfairness. He was a bit starstruck. If you had a big name, he would do more for you than if you were just a regular prisoner, and that invariably caused resentment among some of the prisoners or some of the internees. I keep using the word prisoner, and that's wrong. I shouldn't do that. My apologies. So Commander Daniel, he's the man in charge. He liked to drink, apparently. That was, some of the testimony from some of the internees afterwards said that. But mostly, I think the reviews of him were fairly positive. Now, here's a character. There's so many great writers and artists and musicians in the camp. But this guy is Hans Brick, the lion tamer. His name is also Johann Nunzer. Why I show this? Well, there's a couple of reasons. The windows, if you can see these beautiful depictions of animals on the windows, all for security reasons, all of the windows in the camp were painted blue, and all the lights within the houses were red light bulbs. Somebody in the Home Office decided that this was the best way to promote darkness in order to stave off German bombers flying overhead, which they did regularly on their way to Belfast to drop their payloads there. So what some of the men did in the camp is they got fed up of this blue, dark blue, depressing window scenes, and they started to carve artistically into the windows, using, etching things into the paint. And this menagerie of animals obviously suits Hans Brick, the lion tamer, because that was his job. Hans Brick, and he's also called Johann Nunzer. He has two names. He goes by two different names. Hans Brick kind of shows the absurdity of this whole operation. He was born in Germany, but the circumstances of his birth were this. His father was a lion tamer who died performing. I think he was in Italy at the time, and Hans's mother was in Germany, and she wasn't even German, but she was in Nuremberg, and she gave birth. When she heard the news about her husband, she took fright and gave birth. And she died, and he ended up being raised by somebody else. But the very fact that he was born in Germany was enough to have Hans Brick arrested in England and placed in Hutchinson Camp. He had no affinity to Germany. He had spent very little time there. He was actually quite a famous character in 30s Britain, working at zoos and in shows with animals and stuff. So Hans Brick was placed in Hutchinson Camp, for being perceived to be a threat, potential German fifth column. He had no affinity with Germany whatsoever. And he wasn't there that long, but he left an impact. And I will tell you why, is because Hans Brick if you're stuck in an internment camp and boredom is an issue, Hans Brick is the guy you want next to you, because he will tell stories, some of them no doubt tall tales, about hunting for wild animals in Africa, so the animals could be tamed and used in shows. He was brilliant with a whip. He would use the whip to catch mice in the camp. He would use the whip apparently to lob the head off flowers in the camp. He would, do all sorts of things to entertain the fellow internees. And obviously a man who's working in a circus, traveling the world, which he did. He was in Africa, in Asia, all over the world with zoos, has better stories to tell probably than everybody else. And even the circumstances of his departure from the camp, he's one of the first people to be released. And the reason is, well, there's a couple of different versions of the story, but the one that I prefer, because it's most entertaining, is that he had a wonderful act with this lion called Habibi. They were quite famous, Hans Brick and Habibi. He could stick his head in Habibi's mouth, and they had this incredible understanding. And Habibi was struggling without Hans Brick, while Hans Brick was behind barbed wire on the Isle of Man. So Hans Brick was released, and even then the story was that when he went to collect Habibi, the person who was minding or babysitting Habibi said, "I'm not releasing him to you until you pay me money for all the food that I've given him in your absence." At which point Hans Brick then allegedly returned in the dead of night with his whip, picked the lock of the cage, stared down Habibi, who recognized him, and then placed the whip around Habibi's neck and marched 10 miles through the streets of London to Pinewood Studios, where he had gotten a job as an animal wrangler, and for which role he needed Habibi as well. Again, the historical exactitude of that story remains to be seen, but it's such a fantastic story. I love to tell it because it sums up the madness of this whole thing, really. And then to talk about the art, I talked about Kurt Schwitters earlier. Kurt Schwitters was a very successful German artist in the 20s and into the early 30s. He is sometimes lumped in with the Dada movement, which he kind of railed against that classification. He had his own offshoot of kind of modern art called Merz, M-E-R-Z. And Schwitters had a very promising career, a very successful career. He worked as doing printing as well, but he was a very successful artist in his own right. And then the election, or when Hitler took over, that was bad news for Kurt Schwitters. The title here says Degenerate Artist. Kurt Schwitters featured in one of Hitler's degenerate art exhibits, where, as some of you may know, Hitler had his cronies select some of the quote unquote worst art, the most degenerate art, and it was put on display badly. It was hung awkwardly. It was meant to look terrible. It was obviously by accident then one of the best collections of art ever, even though Hitler thought it was degenerate. But Kurt Schwitters featured in that alongside people like Picasso, illustrious company. But Kurt Schwitters' career in Germany was cut short by Hitler coming to power. He had a couple of run-ins with the Nazis. He was a colorful character. He wasn't, he was no shrinking violet. He would speak his mind. He had a run-in with a Nazi party official at a function one time. So eventually Kurt Schwitters decides discretion is a better part of valor, and he escapes to Norway, where he had a holiday home, and he had spent summers. So he flees to Norway with his son Ernst, and that's good for them until, of course, the Nazis invade Norway. And then there's this kind of comical scene where the Nazis are moving up through Norway and Kurt Schwitters is one step ahead of them. He gets arrested by the Norwegians at one point and then released. And then he continues his flight through Norway until he gets deep into the Arctic Circle, into Tromsø, 300 miles inside the Arctic Circle. And he catches a spot on the last icebreaker out of Tromsø, which is carrying some members of the fleeing Norwegian government. And him and his son Ernst get on it. By one account, he got on it because one of the Norwegian ministers recognized him and decided he should be saved. So he gets on this icebreaker from Norway, from Tromsø, that's sailing to Britain. Again, safety and sanctuary is at hand. When Kurt Schwitters gets to Scotland, he gets arrested for being German and eventually ends up at Hutchinson Camp. And some of the people like Henriksen, Klaus Henriksen, and other artists, immediately they know the name. Some of them didn't recognize him by what he looked like or how he was dressed, but they soon knew the name and they knew the reputation. So Schwitters comes into camp, and I think in many ways the picture here captures him as a kind of a jovial, larger than life character, and that's what he was. He was a real presence. The testimonies of the other internees talk about, what a contribution he made to life there, because he was much more than an artist. He did spoken word poetry. He had written he had written plays. He had a lot of different kind of. He was a Renaissance man, if you want to say it like that. And he would put on shows and entertain the internees and possibly the guarding British troops as well. So Schwitters was a real character in the place. But like every artist, he was, in the beginning, they struggled with materials, so they scavenged where they could. Sure, Schwitters scavenged people's porridge. When people finished their breakfast, he would go around to each of the houses and collect the uneaten porridge, and then he would make sculptures out of the porridge, which was ingenious and quite brilliant. Except if you were living in the room underneath Schwitters, because eventually the sculptures would melt and the porridge would seep down through the floorboards into your bed, which didn't make him very popular with the people down below. Also, Schwitters had this thing where he had draped sheets over his table in his room, and he liked to improvise that he created a kennel for himself, like some sort of barking dog therapy. And one of the other prisoners, I think it's Fred Ullman, tells the story of walking over, it's either Ullman or Henriksen, tells the story about walking over to Schwitters' house and seeing Schwitters having a full-scale conversation with one of the other Austrian internees in dog language, like barking at each other back and forth, but as if they were both understanding each other's bark. So he was a really entertaining, offbeat, left field character. I showed the painting earlier that he did of Klaus Henriksen. I'll show another one he did of Fred Ullman in a moment. And Schwitters was a big presence in the camp, contributed to the cultural life. Years later, decades after World War II was over, when internees from Hutchinson Camp would bump into each other on the streets of London, which they invariably did, they would speak to each other in one of the made-up spoken word poem or spoken word languages that he had invented for one of his poems. So they would remember phrases from that and they would say it to each other, and that was kind of like the secret handshake of the Hutchinson prison or the Hutchinson internees later on when they were back in civilian life back in London. So I think that's a really telling illustration of his impact on the lives of the other people there. So Schwitters was again, I'm not an art historian, but according to some of the leading British art historians, he is the only major artist from the 20th century to die in Britain. He died in the northeast of England just after World War II, just when he was starting to regain momentum. He had been commissioned by MoMA in New York and was kind of rebuilding his career, and he died of pneumonia or bronchitis, I can't remember which. And so again, my point is, I love to tell the colorful stories of life in the camp, but these were men whose careers and lives had been interrupted, their cultural activities interrupted and truncated by being placed in this camp. And again, another example of this is this man, Rudolph Alden. Rudolph Alden was a journalist and a lawyer who had battled Hitler throughout the 1930s, had fought Hitler throughout the 1930s in political arenas with his journalism, in courtrooms. In fact, he had been a scourge of Hitler and the Nazis. He was forced to flee in a hurry. He on wooden skis. He went across the Zittau Mountains into what was then Czechoslovakia, fled to Prague. He ended up at Oxford University. He spent his time in exile writing books, attacking Hitler, wanting to expose Hitler even before the rest of Europe. He fled, I think, in 1933. He wanted to expose Hitler before the rest of Europe really cottoned on to how bad Hitler was. He had dedicated his life to writing about this, and yet he was interned, which was incredibly depressing for him. He was only in the camp a short while, but internees who were interviewed later on. And, there are audio interviews with a lot of these men that were conducted in the 1970s by the Imperial War Museum in London, which is an absolute treasure trove of material. They talked about Alden being the spirit of the camp. He set the tone. He was an intellectual titan, a powerhouse. And he's an incredibly sad tale, because when he was interned, there were questions in the House of Commons like, what is this guy doing in an internment camp? He is a scourge of Hitler. He has spoken to us at length. He has written at length for British newspapers about Hitler. But Alden is in Hutchinson Camp, I think, for 3 or 4 weeks. He's released he's in ill health when he's released, and he's released on the grounds that he must go to America, where he has been offered a job at the New School University here in New York, and he's sailing to Canada on board a ship called the City of Benares, which is sunk by a German U-boat just off the coast of Donegal, off the island, 600 miles from Donegal in Ireland, just off the coast of Ireland. And he and his wife are killed with the City of Benares, and their daughter, who I think was 2, maybe 2.5, around that age, had already been sent ahead to Canada, and that's actually where they were sailing to, was to Newfoundland to collect his daughter and then move to their new life in New York. And they, so they got him in the end, if you like. The Nazis got him one way or the other. They had been trying to get him for years. So again, the absurdity, the inanity of going after somebody, putting Alden behind barbed wire was quite ridiculous. As was pointed out in some of the obituaries, he had been fighting Hitler a lot longer than most of the people who voted to put him behind barbed wire. But when Alden was there in those first few weeks, I will just leave this PowerPoint up for this. I just want to talk a little bit about the university aspect of it, because that's the title of the book. The Germans, this is true of lots of prisoner of war camps and internment camps. They're very resourceful places. People put their time to good use. Within 2 weeks of the camp opening, they had a full slate of classes being run in just about every subject imaginable. Now, the one difference is the quality. I'll just give you the statistic. There was 150 different teachers taught 600 classes in the first 6 months of life in the camp. And what was amazing about that was they had no facilities. It was a very nice summer in 1940. So there was a lot of outdoor teaching, literally setting up with a group of people on the grass and al fresco and teaching and lecturing. But the quality of many of the professors, these were men who had been taken from Oxford and Cambridge and other august institutions, and now they are lecturing to a group of internees on a patch of grass in the Isle of Man. So there were, I'm actually going to give a little quote here from, I think this is a quote from Henriksen about the education, the standard, actually, this is a quote from Fred Ullman, who I'll talk about in a second. I'm going to read this directly. What could one do if Professor William Cohn's talk on the Chinese theater coincided with Egon Wellis's introduction to Byzantine music? Perhaps one felt more inclined to hear Günter Zuntz on the Odyssey, or Richard Friedenthal talking about the Shakespearean stage. Every evening, one could see the same procession of hundreds of internees, each carrying his chair to one of the lecturers. And the memory of all these men in pursuit of knowledge is one of the most moving and encouraging that I brought back from the strange microcosm in which I lived for so many months. So you had an incredible caliber of teachers available to these men, but there was quite some snobbishness as well. I mentioned Professor Paul Jacobsdahl earlier, professor of Celtic and archaeology and Celtic studies. He wrote an essay about his time in the camp. And he said he refused to get involved in the university. They called it Barbed Wire University themselves. That's why I went with the title. He refused to get involved with that. He was snobbish about it. But Jacobsdahl and other dons had a kind of a private underground nightly meeting of the leading intellects in the camp. That was invitation only. And they would do things like have a book club where they would read the Odyssey, but it would be a guided reading of the Odyssey by somebody who was a specialist in the Odyssey. Again, the thing that I find hilarious with this is there were so many incredibly learned people in the camp, but as somebody who works in education, a lot of professors together can collectively not be that smart. So what I mean by that is Dr. Gunther Zuntz, who was one of the professors from Oxford. His wife stayed back in Oxford, and she had sent him a package of daffodil bulbs to brighten up, to plant so they could brighten up the place. And she had sent it in a care package with biscuits and stuff like that. And afterwards, Gunther wrote back to his wife. He wrote, "There was something very wrong with the onions you sent." He said, "They tasted awful." So daffodil bulbs, the professors thought were onions, and they ate them, and they didn't taste very well, as you can imagine. Also, another character who I don't have on the slides here, Dr. Gerhard Bursu, who was the leading archaeologist, I think, or certainly one of the leading archaeologists in Europe at that time. Bursu was in the camp, and somebody in the Isle of Man Museum figured out that having the greatest archaeologist of the time, or one of them in the camp, was a waste. And eventually Bursu and his wife, who was also an archaeologist, got permission to conduct daily digs on the Isle of Man. And one of the ways the men could get out for the day in the fresh air in the country was to volunteer to work on the dig with Dr. Gerhard Bursu. And again, about all of these academics, a lot of them had fled Hitler because once the Nazis took over, you tailored your syllabus or you tailored your research to reflect what the Nazis wanted it to say, or you lost your job. That's why so many of them got out. And again, how were professors able to get out? Because they were better off members of society. Once it became obvious how dangerous the Nazis were, having the wherewithal, financial and political connections, whatever, to get out, it was easier if you were an academic to do that. There are other ways. I tell the story in the book of a man called Ronald Stent, which was the English name he took. His name was Rudolph Stent. Ronald Stent was in business. His father did a lot of business with London, and he went to London to work for the Holroyd's lighting shop. And one of the ways he needed to buy into the Holroyd shop to be able to be allowed to stay in England. And his dad sent over this lamp stuffed with Dutch guilders on a ship. And that was how Ronald was able to buy a stake in the company and then be allowed to stay in England. It didn't stop him from being interred. He was still interned when the time came. So next up, these two people, Marion Rawitch and Walter Landauer. And this obviously is a cover. I have purloined the cover of an album of theirs. They were two of the great music hall acts of the time. They had come to England because the Prince of Wales had seen them in Vienna and said, "You guys would go over huge in Britain." And they took a chance and they moved to England, and they became absolutely massive stars in England. They were in movies in the 30s that were made in England. They were regulars, they were on the BBC. They would sell out concert halls. They did afternoon recitals in Harrods. I mean, they became darlings of the English establishment. And then when the time came, when war broke out, actually, they were very active with the Red Cross. They did, in the first year of the war, they did 80 concerts for the Red Cross. They were on Armed Forces Radio, and they were doing everything they could, but they were still interned. Now, it was Rawitch ended up in my camp, or in Hutchinson Camp, sorry, in the camp that I write about. And Rawitch ends up there, and he's such a big name that Commander Daniel, who I showed earlier, recognizes Rawitch and says, like, "It's Rawitch and Landauer." And of course, Daniel's competitive, wants to show off. He says to Rawitch, "If I can get Landauer and two baby grand pianos, will you play a concert for the camp?" And Rawitch says, "Of course." So Daniel sources two baby grand pianos from somewhere. Now remember, every house in the camp had a piano, but the pianos were, ramshackle affairs that had been there for decades. You couldn't expect maestros to play those. So he sourced the two baby grand pianos, and they have this elaborate outdoor concert. Daniel gets to invite officers from other camps so he can show off. And some of the men write about it and talk about it in their accounts of life in the camp, how it was this wonderful moment where they're playing music and it's wafting across the summer air and you're outside and it's beautiful and it's idyllic. But again, I paint these pictures, but I want to point out that many of these men were struggling. They were struggling with life in the camp, and life in the camp was incredibly tough. for many of these people. There was, there was a lot of depression, a lot of mental health problems. One character threw himself repeatedly at the barbed wire fence, until he was basically carried away to hospital. Egon Wellisch, the great professor of music, who was also a composer, he didn't compose a single note of music from 1938 to 1944. He worked in the camp. He helped. He taught a very promising musician called Hans Furth in the camp, a young prodigy. But Egon Wellisch didn't compose a single note while he was in the camp because he was battling depression while he was there. So yes, the musical community was very vibrant and it entertained the people. Lots of the internees would stand outside the house where the musicians were rehearsing and just listen to them rehearse because it was so beautiful. Hans Furth was 19 years old when he came into the camp, was a piano prodigy. He thought it was great being in the camp. He had no family. He wasn't leaving a wife and kids at home or a career outside of the camp. So he was in the camp just playing music all day with way more talented, way more experienced men who were also teaching him stuff. So he had a kind of an idyllic experience in the camp. Hans Furth later became a professor of psychology at a university here in America, led an extraordinarily rich life, spent 7 years as a Carthusian monk as well, and then played piano to fund his education and went on to become a psychology professor. What I'm doing right now is the common mistake that people make when they talk about things. I will speak even faster, which probably isn't great given my hybrid Irish/American accent, and I apologize for that. I will try to slow down. Here's a slide from one of the this is of artists at work. I believe the man on the right, the teacher, if you like, is Paul Hamann, who was a very famous sculptor. And again, just to connect the thing to the war, he would make life masks of people, and he had made a life mask of Churchill's wife. He had been commissioned to do that in 1930, and now Churchill has him behind barbed wire at Hutchinson Camp. The person he's teaching there is, I think, Peter Fleischmann, who later took the name Midgley, who came over in his late teens on the Kinder transport, and later became a very, very well-known artist and an art professor in his own right. Because there was a real atmosphere of the older musicians, the older artists, help the young. The artists, indeed, many of them, they would meet every day in an impromptu kind of artists' cafe that they had put together in a laundry room in one of the houses, and it was supposed to replicate the Café Dome in Paris, the great bohemian, artistic, creative hub of 20s and 30s Paris. But their artists' version of that at Hutchinson was in a laundry room. And as one of the artists said, it was very like the Café Dome, except for the fact that we had wet underpants dripping down on top of us from on high as we talked highfalutin artistic matters as well at the same time. Here's a photograph from one of the art exhibits that I referenced earlier. Again, there was a major triumph for Daniel, but it was also good for the men in terms of their mental health. It was a very positive thing to prepare for it and to actually showcase your work and get praise for it. Not all artists participated. Again, some men in the camp believed if you participated in the music, cultural, artistic life of the place or academic life, you were collaborating with with the British authorities, and you were sanctioning what they were doing to you. So some of them sat it out on those grounds. This photograph is many of the men had wives, and many of those wives were in another camp elsewhere on the island. So what they would do is on a Saturday afternoon, they would meet at a hotel they would meet at an appointed hotel. The men would be brought there first. They would basically set up the room with like every little tables with 2 chairs, and they would sit there waiting for the wives to arrive. And then when the wives would arrive, in one account that I read of that, they basically would stand and applaud their wives as they walked in the room. And then they would have half an hour to talk to their wives in that room, and that supervised setup. And again, you can see them here dressed in their Sunday best, flowers, etc. Going off on their kind of group date, if you want to call it that, rather awkwardly. very quickly then, this guy, Heinrich Frankel, was apologies for my German pronunciation. Heinrich Frankel was a writer who arrived at the camp, and he went to Daniel's office and he said, I have a very specific set of requirements. I need a private room, I need a typewriter, and I need these books sourced and sent to me. And I also need these documents sent from my house in London. And Daniel said, why do you need this? Because I'm writing a book. It's due at Victor Gallant's publishers in a few weeks, and I'm in a hurry. And Daniel says, what's the title of the book? And Frankel says, it's Help Us Germans to Beat the Nazis. So a man who's writing a book about advising you how to beat the Nazis is interned in the prison, interned in Hutchinson Camp, where he then actually does get a private room and does finish the book, and the book does get published later in 1940. And Frankel again was an anti-Nazi who had fled Germany, fought against the fought in the Spanish Civil War, and then did some screenwriting for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and then ends up in England and ends up being interned in the camp. And before I finish then, I will just talk just very briefly about Fred Ullman, who Fred Ullman again was very active in social democratic politics in Germany, which obviously brings him into the brings him onto the radar of the Nazis, and he is forced to flee. Germany. He ends up in Paris, where he had a relative. He hangs around the Café Dome in Paris with all of the great artists of the time, becomes an artist himself. Then he flees to Spain. When he's in Spain, he meets this beautiful young debutante called Diana Croft, who is the daughter of nobility, and she's come to England, or she's on a kind of a grand tour, if you like, with her friend. Fred Ullman and Diana Croft fall in love. He moves back to London. They get married. The wrinkle is that her father, Sir Henry Croft, is a very hardcore right-wing politician, and Henry Croft will end up being Under Secretary of State for War in Churchill's war cabinet. So Fred Ullman's father-in-law is a member of Churchill's cabinet, yet Fred Ullman is still arrested. While his wife Diana is pregnant with their first child, he's arrested and interned. How would the father-in-law allow that to happen? Well, Sir Henry Croft hated Germans, and he hated Jews, and he hated left-wingers. And Fred Ullman was German, Jewish, and a left-winger. So he basically was everything that his father-in-law hated. Now, just before I finish, I just want to emphasize how difficult it was for many of them in the camp. So Fred Ullman kept a diary, and I'm just gonna quote you one of the days from the diary. September 7th, 1940. This is Fred Ullman's diary. Again, this terrible, ghastly, sickening depression. Nothing will help, no courage nor logic. The black cloud will not despair. I hate seeing people. Rumors about air raids over London, which can only mean I will not be released for weeks and weeks. And he's right, he doesn't get released until Christmas Eve. But Ullman suffered in the camp, like a lot of them did, because there was uncertainty. You didn't know when you were getting out. There was fear. They were always afraid that the Nazis were going to invade the island. In fact, many of them had plans in place to either commit suicide or to commandeer a boat and try to drift across to Ireland. They had all sorts of escape plans because the threat of a Nazi invasion was a real thing hanging over them. But Ullman is very typical of many of the men who were in the camp in this regard. That when he left, he wrote a couple of books. He wrote The Makings of an Englishman, about his own life, basically a memoir. He wrote a beautiful novella called Reunion, which is still in print and is regarded by critics as a minor masterpiece. His art, he did okay with his art too, until an eye problem forced him to give up that. But many of the men wrote books. They were a very prolific kind of, Richard Friedenthal, one of the writers in the camp, wrote a book called The World in a Nutshell in German. That's the English translation of the title, which is a fictionalized account of life in the camp, which many of the men bristled about because they felt that they were all depicted unfairly, as people normally do when they're depicted in fiction. So to sum up, I should just show you, as many of you know this view, this is Hutchinson Square today, or certainly that was it 3 years ago when I visited. What is amazing to me is the houses are just the same. Obviously, the cars in front of the houses are different, but the houses are just the same. It's remarkable, like you can walk in the footsteps of history of this camp. And again, my book centers on the first year of life in the camp. And then, it started to peter out over that year because more and more of the artists and writers were released as the government realized the absurdity of their policy of interning everybody just because they were born in a certain country. And there was a very mundane look at what the place looks like today. Thank you very much for listening. I apologize if I spoke a little fast there at times. That's a kind of an affliction of professors and Irish people as well. So it's a double whammy for me there. Thank you again for listening and for the invitation. And if there are any questions, I'd love to answer them.
Thank you very much, Dave. That was excellent. Could I ask you to stop screen sharing, and then people will be able to see you writ large on the screen? Excellent. Good. Great. Right. So now's the moment to ask questions. We have one or two coming in. One at least has actually been more or less answered by you. But I wonder if I'm just going to perhaps spotlight myself. So. And we need to make sure that you certainly need to be visible. Very good. Right, okay. Where to start? Again, so many things one might say. Perhaps I must confess, I felt initially that you were in a sense seduced by the colourfulness, the picaresque nature of so many of these human individual stories, and it's very easy to do that. I mean, they are all individually quite extraordinary. And also you commented quite rightly on the fact that there's a whole surreal, absurd aspect to the whole episode, really, which makes it tempting to kind of make light of it. But I think you then, in a sense, you did what you needed to do to actually keep reminding us that actually these were stories of profound displacement and dislocation, and indeed worse. There was real trauma experience, there was depression, there was fear of Nazi invasion. I mean, you mentioned some were ready to commit suicide. I think cyanide pills were kept in readiness in the case of the Nazis invading. Just think, how convenient it would have been for the Germans had, the Brits had done the job for them, sort of corral them together. And I think, on the back of that comment, it's worth mentioning apropos Fred Ullman, and I noticed you skipped through one slide, the Captivity album. He actually, I think his best work was actually done in captivity. I mean, really rather wonderful pen and ink drawings. I should also add, I just can't help adding that you probably don't know that his daughter, Caroline Compton, actually just died very recently, and I knew her quite well. She was a wonderful woman, and that was a sense of kind of living connection to this history. So I do miss her. But also it's very striking, and I think it wasn't just Ullman, but he wrote at the time these very frank expressions of depression and sort of anguish, actually, and the images express that too. But actually, as time goes by, and this is, I think, true of many of the former internees, they not make light, but they kind of, they sort of underplay the dark nature of the experience in favor of a sense of almost benign tolerance. Oh, the British government didn't really have a choice. You have to understand it in a historical context. But I think it is actually really important, and I'm sure you'll agree, to remember how dark an experience it was for all the good sides, the good things and the creativity and the lectures on the lawn, etc. But actually it's a morally murky, and actually for many people a profoundly disturbing experience, and I think it should remain so for us looking at it today. I don't really need to answer that, but I think I imagine you will agree.
No, and another thing that I didn't mention, like there were wives that were interned and there were wives that weren't, but there were marriages. There were lots of marriages were put under pressure and broke by this experience. That were affected by this. So it wasn't just like careers were interrupted, but lives were interrupted and never regained the momentum. It cost them a marriage, cost them their kids, stuff like that. There's a lot of a negative side. I think the reason that the men may have made lighter of it later is because as the Holocaust became, as the true scope of the Holocaust became obvious, I felt, I think there's a sense from some of these men that, we were lucky then, we were lucky. You know, they lost family members. You know, lots of these men lost family members in the Holocaust. So, you know, they were affected by that as well. But they would look at their own experience as possibly not as, obviously not as traumatic as it might have been.
No, I'm sure that's right. But of course, that was another source of anxiety for them at the time. What is happening to our families, our loved ones, you know, back in Europe? Absolutely. Connected with all this, there's a question from Sarah Shear, who I see on the screen there, asking what percentage of the internees, and it was interesting that you sometimes use the word prisoner, which suggests an element of guilt. I think, you know, internee is a term perhaps that's better to use, but, you know, they were prisoners, of course, for a while, sometimes not for very long, but they were behind barbed wire, so in a sense, yes, they were prisoners. But, you know, what percentage of them were actually Jewish or partly Jewish or of Jewish background? And of course, the answer is the huge majority, Sarah, if I can answer briefly, but Dave, do you want to comment further on?
No, I think the figure that I came up with, and because it changes day to day, you know, or it changes, you know, prisoners come, or excuse me again, internees come in, internees go out. It changed. Some of them were had converted from Judaism, but I think about 70% at any given time were estimated to be Jewish, certainly in the beginning, in the first few months. And there was, I write about this in the book, there was a kosher house of Orthodox Jews, where there's a very comical scene where they refuse, it's on the Sabbath, there's an air raid and they won't out the light, nobody will turn the light off, and the commandant is freaking out because in the kosher house the light's on and they won't allow any Jew to touch it. They won't allow any Jew to touch it, to turn off the light. And by the time they are, you know, it's a big, he's screaming into a loudspeaker because they had a PA system, you know, turn off the effing light. And the Jews are like, no, in the kosher house, nobody, we need a Gentile with no Jewish blood to come and turn off the light. They may also have just been, you know, screwing with him just to kind of, you know, to make a point. We can't discount that too. But I think 70% was a number that I came up with came across quite regularly. But again, the role or the roster of internees changed on a quite regular basis.
I'm interested that you say 70%. I have a hunch, and I don't have the evidence that actually would have been quite a lot higher than that, because of course you're talking about the Orthodox, the kosher house, but it, you know, the whole spectrum of what being Jewish might mean was represented in Hutchinson, as indeed in the other camps. And let's not forget that so many of the communists, you know, the anti-fascists, you know, were indeed Jewish as well. So I think, you know, I would guess it's certainly a huge, it's a large majority for sure, but interesting that, you know, one can't ascertain.
Could I come in, Monica?
Yeah, yes, of course.
Hi, just very briefly. Yes, the sort of received percentage is 90%, but here, of course, we're talking about Nazi criteria. We're not talking about religion. That didn't matter at all. It's almost irrelevant whether you converted or whatever. 90% of the refugees to Britain from Nazism were considered Jewish by the Nazis. That's what counted. So probably, you know, the percentage in the internment camps would have been very similar. Yeah, there was no,
No, absolutely. And if I can just pick up on that, thanks, Anna. You know, you mentioned that, you know, you might have to tailor what you taught, for example, as an academic in Germany, because if you were Jewish, you didn't have that choice. So I think, you know, one has to be a little careful here not to underestimate the significance of being branded Jewish by the Nazis and therefore being, you know, forced to flee to the apparent safety of this country. Any other questions? The women, yes, the women internees, absolutely. It's a whole interesting topic. That's obviously connected. Hutchinson was an all-male camp, as indeed all the ones in Douglas and elsewhere on the island were, with the exception of Port Erin and Port St Mary in collectively called Russian Camp in the south of the island, which is where the women were interned, fewer in number, and many of them were interned because of their Germanness, their Jewishness, and or their there's sort of, well, again, perceived to be enemies of the state, of the British state, of course. So once again, very complicated. What's worth mentioning, Dave, again, one thing you didn't mention, and it wasn't so true in Hutchinson, but initially at least, an awful lot of the predominantly Jewish internees across the board were actually put in the same spaces as fascist and Nazi sympathizers. Yeah? So that's just kind of adding injury to insult. And it was particularly true in the women's camp, just in answer to that question. So
Yeah, and I mean, again, my problem is the question is, were there any women? I could never ascertain why one person's wife was interned elsewhere on the island, and then another person's wife was still back in London. You know, I don't know what the criteria was, how they worked that. I didn't figure that out. You know, because the problem with researching something like this is you get into the camp, and then you're overwhelmed with information about the camp, and then you realize there are all these other camps, and there are all these other stories, and they're all great stories, and they're all not great stories, but they're fascinating stories, because it's a, you know, I mean, even there's a story of a one prisoner who gets married in the camp because he has a visa for Cuba for him and his fiance, but they have to be married. So the camp, they organized for them to be married in the registry office in Douglas. He's marched down the hill. His wife-to-be is flown across to Douglas, and they get married, and then they have a little ceremony just by the barbed wire outside the camp. And then 2 weeks later, he's freed to go to Cuba with her. He ended up actually becoming a very prominent member of a Jewish community in upstate New York, because he ultimately moved from Cuba to New York. But again, you know, it's a kind of a strange. The rules did not, and this also annoyed a lot of the men when you listen to their audio testimony, or when you read what they wrote at the time. If you get access to that, letters and stuff, they were very annoyed that the criteria seemed very malleable and they could change, you know, and they didn't like, for instance, Paul Jacobstow did not understand why he, a professor of archaeology, was arrested, but his neighbor, a German refugee who was a dentist, was left behind, you know, and they were frustrated. They were frustrated with that, and then they were frustrated about the release criteria. There was a series of government white papers, and they would constantly changing, you know, why you could be released under what grounds. So they would, I think, you know, when we talk about the mental health impact, there's incredible frustration because you didn't know how long you were going to be there. You didn't know what was happening to your family, and you know, you didn't know how you were you didn't know how best you could get out, you know, what you could best do to get yourself out. And that's why some of the men had a kind of a policy of non-cooperation, because Daniel's big thing, after they realized that none of these men were escaping to go anywhere to fight for the Germans, a lot of them would be brought down to the water to go swimming. They would be brought to the cinema, which was just down the hill from Hutchinson. They would have outings, but some of the men would boycott that and say, we're not doing this because that's kind of, we're accepting the circumstances of our internment and acquiescing with it by doing that.
No, it's a story fraught with inconsistencies and, you know, a certain amount of arbitrariness. And yeah, I mean, it's actually quite extraordinary, isn't it? Another very specific historical question from Sarah Shear. Did the Germans ever have a plan to invade the Isle of Man? As a historian, I wonder.
Not that I came across. No. I mean, not that I came across. I know the men's big worry was that the Germans would invade Ireland as a kind of a launch pad for Britain, and then if they did that, the Isle of Man would be an obvious stopping off point upon, you know. That's when I talk about these men making contingency plans for what would happen in the event of an invasion. They were very worried about the Germans getting into Ireland, and then, you know, it's 80 miles from Ireland to Douglas or to the Isle of Man, and then 80 miles from there to Liverpool. So it would be an obvious stopping off point. But, you know, I never came across a formal German plan to invade the Isle of Man.
Would they have been aware that there were internment camps though on the Isle of Man? I imagine, yes.
Yeah, I think they were. I think absolutely, yeah. They would have been, because, you know, there were spies in London, and there was one character who I don't mention in my, when I give a talk about the book, I don't mention this guy. It's a very complicated chapter. A guy called Ludwig Varshar, who was a spy, basically, but he was he was very good at, he was involved in this thing called the TEFL listening device. But he was treated differently, and Commander Daniel was, you know, seduced by this guy. He thought this guy was fantastic, and he put him in charge of the technical school, whereas all the Jewish prisoners would say, I remember him collaborating with the Nazis. When we lost our right to drive, he was still driving because he was a collaborator. And, you know, Warsaw was a very dark character who spent the entire war interned in different places. And I think he ends up in prison in London before being deported back to Germany in 45 or 46.
Dave, I'm aware of time rushing on, as it tends to do when the subject's so fascinating, but there's a question from Leslie Orbach, which I don't think you have actually touched on yet. It's an obvious question that I'm sure everybody is also wanting to ask. And thanks for your talk. But, oh no, sorry. Apologies if you said this at the start, but what made you decide to research this topic in the first place? Tell us a little bit about how you got to it.
Well, I'm an Irishman teaching Americans about world history. That's my day job. And I was listening to a history podcast by Dan Snow, where he talked to David Baddiel, the comedian, about his family connection to the internment camps. And Hutchinson came up in detail in that chat. I'd never heard of it. As an Irish person, I'm obviously always excited to hear a story where Churchill is the villain, Churchill being the great, bête noire of the Irish. So when I delved into it, I just became fascinated by it. And I'd never been to the Isle of Man, and I got just totally into the story. And my sister converted to Judaism many years ago when she married a Frenchman, and so I have an affinity to the religion, and I basically wanted to know more about the story.
You also mentioned, and I'm naturally intrigued to know more, that you have had access to hitherto unresearched or undiscovered material. I wonder if you're able to tell us a little bit more about that.
The Imperial War Museum, and I mean, any of the people at this, some of them, the Imperial War Museum has these audio files that were done in the 70s that are absolutely fantastic, not just if you're writing a book, but obviously they're very good for that, but you can listen to these men talking in great detail about their lives. And some of them are free if you just log on to the website. Some of them are restricted. You have to buy them and you have to apply for permission to listen to them, but some of them are free, and they are fantastic resources and just a wonderful way of listening. You can hear stuff and you can hear them telling the stories, and obviously some of the stories contradict each other. But yeah, there was a lot of stuff. And there was, you mentioned Yvonne Cresswell, who you met in the Isle of Man, who's an incredible character. Just what a resource, and what a what a font of all knowledge of this stuff, who was a tremendous guide to me in my time there, and showing me stuff like art done on the back of cigarette packs. Because again, I kind of didn't go into this, but these artists were so resourceful, scavenging materials wherever they could. One of those ramshackle pianos I mentioned, when that piano broke down, these men tore it apart and used every part of it to create art, because they were so desperate for materials. So there's a lot, there's a lot of different elements in this whole story. And there's a lot to admire about these men and the way they applied themselves in these awful, it was an awful circumstance to be in, and an unfair. And I think that's something else. It's an unjust and unfair internment. And that must have been the most galling thing for these people.
Just looking to see, I'm going to hold on Pamela's question, because that ties in with something that Aviva's going to tell us about in a minute. Were there any actual fascists at Hutchinson? Well, you mentioned Varshar. I mean, he was the shadiest character of the lot. If I can just answer that, sorry, Sarah, again, I mean, mustn't go on too long, but actually most of the fascists were actually put in a different camp in Peel on the other side of the island.
And the IRA, the Irish Army. The IRA people were with the fascists, and actually, there's the problem when you go into archives is you find stories and they sidetrack you. Two IRA men and a British fascist escaped from that camp, and they commandeered a boat, and then they drifted off to sea, and they were rescued by the British because they tried to escape, but none of them knew how to sail, and they stole a boat from Douglas, and then they were brought right back. So that has nothing to do with my book, but I came across that in the archives. And this is the problem when you're in archives, is you go down loads of alleys and wander down the byways, and you get distracted, and that's why things take so long.
We could go on much longer, but I think a good place to conclude now might be to tell you, Dave, something you may not even, dare I say it, be aware of, that actually coinciding with the trip that Aviva and myself organized to the Isle of Man was the unveiling of a plaque by the Association of Jewish Refugees with the great and the good of the Isle of Man present at the ferry terminal. It was decided, that was the only place which would kind of in a sense, be relevant to all those who were interned on the Isle of Man, and also an oak tree planting in Hutchinson Square itself as part of the AJR's scheme to plant oak trees to commemorate sites of particular significance to Anglo-Jewish history, or particularly the refugee, sort of the 1930s refugees experiences. So, things are changing. There is greater acknowledgement, but I do believe, that this is a story that needs to be told and retold, and sort of the word for it to be spread and to be debated as well, as widely as possible. So thank you very much, Dave. Indeed, that was really, really interesting.
Thank you very much for having me, guys. I really appreciate it.
Now,
for the questions.
It's a pleasure. I'm going to now hand over to Aviva, but Aviva, I don't know if you can see the chat, but Pamela, I think it's Pamela Howard, has mentioned a PBS series about a girl on the Isle of Man dating a Nazi soldier. Now this is interesting because actually, Pamela, you're getting it mixed up with the Channel Islands. And I'm going to hand over now to Aviva.
Which is hilarious on any number of reasons, not least the fact that when my phone went, when I arrived on the Isle of Man, my phone immediately decided the Isle of Man was the Channel Islands and decided to adopt it as a carrier. When I joked with the locals about this, and in fact, that is something, it's the same phone company that works across them. But when I joked about the electronics not knowing the difference, they said, that's nothing, nor do those who made the movies. Because actually, although Island at War is about the Channel Islands, it was actually filmed on the Isle of Man, which
that's right, indeed, yeah.
Islands. So there is a confusion generally. Monica's brought me on to talk about that because, in fact, just to tell everyone, and you're getting the very, very first announcement here, but all being well, we are going to follow up our trip to the Isle of Man with a trip to the Channel Islands at some point next year. There's been a lot of excavation happening of Jewish stories, and we believe, the AJR believes, that it is time to commemorate as well, both those people who resisted and those people who were taken away to camps, both to Alderney and then deported to Auschwitz. So we will look at the Channel Islands next year as a continuation of this programme. However, before I go on to that, I would just want to say a huge, huge thank you to Dave Hannigan for joining us, and stay with the Isle of Man for a moment. Somebody asked in the chat what Dave's book added. And I know we have been doing a lot of books on the Isle of Man. We've done a whole series of sessions on the Isle of Man with insiders, outsiders, and Jewish Renaissance, with everyone from Simon Parkin, the New Yorker journalist who wrote about the island of extraordinary captives, to artists, the descendants of Ruth Borchardt, for example, who collected artists' work. There's been a huge amount, Klaus Henriksen's family. We've done quite a lot. What I'm really interested with in Dave's book is we've looked both at historical descriptions and everyone from Leah Garrett to Charmian Brinson to Helen Fry talking about what happened to those emigres through a very academic historic lens. We've looked at them from the family perspective. I think what Dave does is kind of looks at them and their stories. I mean, that they're just all these quirky characterizations. You saw that a little bit with the story of the lion tamer, for example, and it just reveals the huge range of people who were interned, particularly in Hutchinson, and adds to that landscape of writing on the Isle of Man. And I think there is quite a lot still to say. One of the things we didn't talk about so much today was the music. I did chuckle when Dave talked about the grand piano description, because when we did our trip, we had a concert by the Ensemble Émigré, led by Norbert Mine, where I had my own similar scramble to get us a grand piano in time. So I know all about all the grand pianos on the Isle of Man now. But I'm mentioning that because something I do want to flag up to you all is that from January to March next year, the Royal College of Music will be hosting an exhibition about the Isle of Man, particularly focusing on the music that was composed there as part of their migration and mobility project, and that's something that Insiders, Outsiders and Jewish Renaissance is hoping to be collaborating on, and we will definitely let you know about events that will be happening. So we are ongoing on the Isle of Man. We're beginning to open to the Channel Islands, and just for those of you who are interested in the emigres and the emigre artists, you might wish to have a look at the Jewish Renaissance website, because this Thursday, Monica's leading a trip to the Barbican, where there is currently an exhibition of emigre art. Many of those emigres are Jewish, and we'd love to see some of you in person at the Barbican and have you join us. So we'll send that information out afterwards, along with information about how to get Dave's book, with some a nice percentage of money off it for all of you who've arrived. And so thank you again, huge thank you to Dave, and also a massive thank you to Monica for chairing this with such warmth and knowledge and grace.
Thank you very much, everyone. And yes, an email will follow with all the requisite information. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. All the very best. And Dave, thank you once again.
Thank you very much, guys. Let's rock again. Cheers. Bye.
Okay, good night.